It's the year 33 before Christ, and the Roman world is holding its breath. The greatest empire in history is about to destroy itself from within. But how did we get here? How did Rome, master of the Mediterranean, end up with two of its most powerful men pointing swords at each other's throats? The story begins with a dagger. 15 years earlier, Julius Caesar lay bleeding on the Senate floor, 23 wounds marking the end of his ambitions. His assassins thought they were saving the Republic. Instead, they had lit a fuse that would burn for over a decade. In the chaos that followed, 3 men emerged to claim Caesar's legacy. Octavian was just 18, Caesar's adopted son and heir. Mark Antony was Caesar's trusted lieutenant, a warrior who had fought beside him in Gaul. Lepidus was the elder statesman, the one who controlled Rome's priests and rituals. Together, they formed what history calls the Second Triumvirate, though it was really just 3 ambitious men agreeing not to kill each other while they carved up the known world. But here's the thing about power-sharing agreements. They never last. Lepidus was the first to fall, quietly pushed aside and forgotten. That left 2 titans circling each other like gladiators in an arena the size of an empire. Octavian took the West, the heart of Rome itself. He was methodical, calculating, the kind of man who would spend months planning a single conversation. Antony got the East, the wealthy provinces that stretched from Greece to the borders of Persia. He was everything Octavian wasn't: charismatic, impulsive, a man who lived life like he was drinking from a fire hose. And then Antony met Cleopatra. Now forget everything Hollywood has told you about this woman. Yes, she was beautiful, but that wasn't her real weapon. Cleopatra was brilliant, speaking 9 languages, personally negotiating with Roman senators, and ruling Egypt with an iron fist wrapped in silk. She had already seduced Julius Caesar himself, and now she set her sights on his successor. When Antony sailed to Egypt in 41 before Christ, he expected to collect tribute and leave. Instead, he found himself enchanted by a queen who arrived to meet him dressed as Aphrodite, goddess of love, on a golden barge that gleamed like the sun itself. She didn't just win his heart, she captured his imagination. Here was a woman who understood power, who ruled an empire as old as time itself. For Octavian back in Rome, this was a gift wrapped in disaster. Every month that Antony spent in Alexandria, every feast he attended, every golden crown he accepted from Egyptian priests, gave Octavian more ammunition. The man who had once been Rome's greatest general was now, according to Octavian's propaganda machine, nothing more than a lovesick puppet dancing to a foreign queen's tune. The breaking point came in 34 before Christ. Antony, drunk on love and Egyptian gold, made a declaration that would seal his fate. In a ceremony that Romans would later call the Donations of Alexandria, he proclaimed Cleopatra the Queen of Kings and began dividing Roman territories between her and their children. To Roman eyes, this wasn't just treason, it was the ultimate betrayal. Antony wasn't just giving away Roman land, he was giving it to Egypt, Rome's ancient rival. Octavian had been waiting for this moment. He seized Antony's will from the temple where it was stored and read it aloud to the Senate. The document revealed that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. For Romans, this was the final straw. Their general had chosen Egypt over the city that had made him great. But Octavian was too clever to declare war on a Roman citizen. Instead, he convinced the Senate to declare war on Cleopatra herself. It was a masterful political move. This wasn't civil war, he claimed. This was Rome defending itself against foreign invasion. Never mind that half the Roman world stood with Antony. Never mind that Roman legions would be fighting Roman legions. On paper, this was Rome versus Egypt, civilization versus barbarism. By 32 before Christ, both sides were mobilizing for what everyone knew would be the final confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in western Greece, choosing the Gulf of Actium as their base. It seemed like a good position, a narrow bay protected by rocky shores, with Egypt's grain ships keeping their army fed. But Octavian had learned from the best. His admiral, Marcus Agrippa, was a tactical genius who had studied every naval battle in Roman history. While Antony's ships were built for ramming and boarding, massive floating fortresses bristling with siege towers and catapults, Agrippa's fleet was designed for speed and maneuverability. His ships were smaller, faster, and carried a secret weapon, fire arrows that could turn wooden warships into floating infernos. As winter turned to spring in 31 before Christ, the noose began to tighten. Agrippa's ships patrolled the waters outside Actium, cutting off supply lines and slowly strangling Antony's forces. Food became scarce. Disease spread through the camps. Desertions began as soldiers realized they might be backing the wrong side. Antony faced an impossible choice. He could march his army north and fight Octavian on land, abandoning his ships and leaving Cleopatra defenseless. Or he could risk everything on a naval battle, trying to break through Octavian's blockade and escape to Egypt where he could regroup and fight another day. Cleopatra made the choice for him. Egypt's wealth was on those ships, and without it, they had nothing. They would fight at sea, win or lose, live or die together. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive battles. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 before Christ, as the sun rose over the Ionian Sea, two fleets would collide in a battle that would determine whether Rome remained a republic or became an empire. The fate of the Western world hung in the balance, and everyone knew it. Neither side could afford to lose. For Octavian, defeat meant death and the end of his dreams of power. For Antony and Cleopatra, it meant the destruction of everything they had built together. As the ships formed their battle lines and the trumpets sounded across the water, 300 vessels prepared to write the final chapter of the Roman Republic in blood and fire. The Battle of Actium was about to begin. Before we dive into this epic tale, like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Empires and ring the notification bell to join us on more journeys through history's most pivotal moments. Now, let's meet the three people who held the fate of Rome in their hands. Each one was brilliant in their own way, each one was flawed, and each one was about to make decisions that would echo through 2,000 years of history. First, there's Octavian, and here's what made him so dangerous. He understood that in politics, perception is everything. While other Romans were obsessed with military glory and dramatic gestures, Octavian was playing chess when everyone else was playing checkers. He was only 32 years old, but he had already learned the most important lesson of Roman politics. It's not enough to defeat your enemies. You have to make everyone else believe they deserve to be defeated. Octavian's propaganda machine was ruthless and brilliant. He didn't just attack Antony's military decisions. He attacked his character, his masculinity, his very identity as a Roman. In Octavian's version of events, Antony wasn't a rival political leader. He was a traitor who had abandoned everything Roman for the exotic pleasures of Egypt. Octavian's writers painted pictures of Antony lounging on silk cushions, fed grapes by Egyptian slaves, while real Romans died defending the empire. But here's the genius part. Octavian never made it about himself. He positioned himself as Rome's protector, the defender of ancient traditions against foreign corruption. Every speech, every proclamation, every piece of propaganda reinforced the same message. Octavian wasn't seeking power for himself. He was saving Rome from a man who had forgotten what it meant to be Roman. And then there was his secret weapon, Marcus Agrippa. While Octavian handled the politics, Agrippa revolutionized Roman naval warfare. This man was an engineer's dream, constantly experimenting with new ship designs, new weapons, new tactics. He had studied every great naval battle in history and learned from each one. His ships were faster than anything the Romans had ever built, equipped with bronze rams that could punch through enemy hulls like paper, and armed with a terrifying new weapon, fire arrows that could turn wooden ships into floating furnaces. Agrippa had also mastered something that would prove crucial at Actium, the art of the blockade. Like a patient fisherman, he knew how to cast his net and wait. His ships didn't just fight battles. They strangled supply lines, cut off reinforcements, and slowly starved enemy forces into submission. It was warfare as siege, and Agrippa was the master of it. Mark Antony's tragedy was that he had once been everything Rome admired in a leader. He was brave to the point of recklessness, leading charges that lesser men wouldn't dare attempt. He was loyal, standing by Julius Caesar when it would have been safer to join the conspirators. He was charismatic, the kind of man who could inspire soldiers to follow him into hell itself. But by 31 before Christ, something had broken inside him. Maybe it was the weight of carrying Caesar's legacy. Maybe it was the pressure of ruling half the known world. Maybe it was simply the realization that Octavian had outmaneuvered him at every turn. Whatever it was, the man who had once been Rome's greatest general was now making mistakes that would have embarrassed a first-year military cadet. His army was starving, and he knew it. His men were deserting, and he could see it happening. His treasury was empty, and he was borrowing money from Egyptian merchants just to pay his soldiers. Worst of all, his Roman supporters were beginning to question whether they had backed the right side. Every day brought new reports of senators and generals switching to Octavian's cause. Antony's personal life had become a political disaster. His marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia had been a political arrangement, but Romans expected him to at least pretend to honor it. Instead, he had openly divorced her to marry Cleopatra, giving Octavian the perfect weapon to use against him. In Roman eyes, divorce was one thing, but abandoning a virtuous Roman woman for a foreign queen was unforgivable. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of entire legions was now dependent on his lover's gold to keep his army together. It was humiliating, and everyone knew it. His own officers whispered behind his back, wondering if their general had lost his mind along with his Roman identity. And then there's Cleopatra, perhaps the most misunderstood figure in this entire story. She wasn't just some exotic beauty who seduced powerful men for fun. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the ruler of a kingdom that had existed for 3,000 years before Rome was even founded. She spoke Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, and half a dozen other languages. She had personally negotiated trade agreements with kings from India to Spain. She was a mathematician, a philosopher, and a politician who had survived in the deadliest game in the ancient world. But here's what made her desperate. She knew that if Octavian won, Egypt would disappear forever. Not just conquered, but erased. Rome had a habit of making examples of kingdoms that dared to challenge its authority. Carthage had been burned to the ground, and its fields salted so nothing would ever grow there again. Corinth had been destroyed so completely that it took a century to rebuild. Egypt, with its wealth and pride and ancient traditions, would be next on the list. Cleopatra's fleet wasn't just her contribution to the battle. It was Egypt's last hope. These weren't just warships. They were floating treasuries, carrying the accumulated wealth of the pharaohs, the gold that decorated their prows, the silver that reinforced their rams, the precious stones that adorned their figureheads. All of it represented centuries of Egyptian prosperity. To lose this fleet would mean losing everything that made Egypt great. She was also fighting for her children. Her son Caesarion was supposedly Julius Caesar's heir, and her twins with Antony represented the future of both Egypt and Rome. If Octavian won, these children would be seen as threats to his power. In the brutal world of Roman politics, that usually meant death. As the summer of 31 before Christ wore on, Octavian's strategy became clear. He wasn't just planning to defeat Antony. He was going to strangle him slowly, methodically, like a spider wrapping its prey in silk. Agrippa's ships formed an invisible noose around Actium's bay, cutting off supply ships from Egypt, intercepting reinforcements from the eastern provinces, and making it impossible for Antony to escape or resupply. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Every day that passed made Antony's situation worse. His men grew hungrier, his allies grew more nervous, and his options grew fewer. Octavian didn't need to win a glorious battle. He just needed to wait while his enemy destroyed himself. The blockade was so effective that Antony's soldiers were reduced to eating roots and bark. Disease spread through the camps as sanitation broke down. Morale collapsed as men realized they might be fighting for a lost cause. Some of Antony's most trusted allies began sending secret messages to Octavian, offering to switch sides in exchange for pardons and positions in the new order. This wasn't just military strategy, it was a masterclass in how to destroy an enemy without giving them the chance to die gloriously in battle. Octavian was making sure that when the final confrontation came, Antony would be so weakened that victory would be inevitable. By early September, the trap was complete. Antony had 3 choices, and all of them were terrible. He could try to break out by sea, risking everything on a naval battle against Agrippa's superior fleet. He could march his army north and fight on land, abandoning his ships and leaving Cleopatra defenseless. Or he could surrender, knowing that Octavian would never let him live. In the end, love made the choice for him. Cleopatra couldn't abandon her fleet, and Antony couldn't abandon Cleopatra. They would sail out together, fight together, and if necessary, die together. It was romantic, it was tragic, and it was exactly what Octavian had been hoping for. The stage was set for the final act of the Roman Republic. 3 brilliant, flawed, desperate people were about to collide in a battle that would determine the future of the Western world. And deep down, all of them knew that only one side would survive to see the sun set on September 2nd, 31 before Christ. Let me tell you about 3 people who couldn't have been more different, yet found themselves locked in a deadly game where only one could survive. Each brought their own genius to this final confrontation, and each carried fatal flaws that would determine their fate. Here's what made Octavian so terrifying. He was only 32 years old, but he had already figured out something that most politicians never learn. In Rome, it wasn't enough to be right. You had to make everyone else believe your enemies were monsters, and Octavian was a master at turning public opinion into a weapon sharper than any sword. Think about this for a moment. Octavian had never won a major battle himself. He wasn't a great speaker like Cicero or a legendary warrior like his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. But he understood something that neither of them had grasped. In a world where most people couldn't read, whoever controlled the story controlled everything. His propaganda machine was ruthless and brilliant. Octavian's writers didn't just attack Antony's military decisions, they attacked his soul. They painted him as a man who had traded his Roman birthright for Egyptian gold, who knelt before a foreign queen while real Romans died defending the empire. They spread stories about Antony wearing Egyptian clothes, worshipping animal-headed gods, and planning to move Rome's capital to Alexandria. But here's the genius part. Octavian never made it about personal ambition. He positioned himself as Rome's reluctant protector, the dutiful son who only wanted to preserve the traditions of his ancestors. Every speech, every proclamation reinforced the same message. This wasn't about Octavian seeking power. This was about saving Rome from a traitor who had forgotten what it meant to be Roman. And then there was his secret weapon, Marcus Agrippa. While Octavian handled the politics, Agrippa revolutionized Roman warfare. This man was like a mad scientist of the ancient world, constantly experimenting with new ship designs, new weapons, new tactics. He had studied every great naval battle in Mediterranean history and learned from each disaster and triumph. Agrippa's ships were works of art disguised as weapons of war. They were lighter than traditional Roman vessels, built for speed rather than brute force. Their bronze rams were designed to punch through enemy hulls like arrows through parchment. Most importantly, they carried a terrifying new weapon, fire arrows that could turn wooden ships into floating infernos in minutes. But Agrippa's real genius lay in understanding patience. While other admirals dreamed of glorious head-to-head battles, he preferred the slow strangulation of blockade warfare. His ships formed invisible nets around enemy harbors, cutting off supplies, intercepting reinforcements, and slowly starving opposing forces into submission. It was warfare as siege, and Agrippa had perfected it into an art form. Mark Antony's story breaks your heart, because he had once been everything Rome admired in a leader. He was brave beyond measure, the kind of general who led cavalry charges that lesser men wouldn't dare attempt. He was loyal to a fault. Standing by Julius Caesar when joining the conspirators would have been safer. He was charismatic enough to inspire soldiers to follow him through hell itself. But by 31 before Christ, something fundamental had shattered inside him. Maybe it was the weight of trying to fill Caesar's massive shadow. Maybe it was the crushing responsibility of ruling half the known world. Or maybe it was simply the slow realization that Octavian had outmaneuvered him at every crucial moment. The man who had once commanded the absolute loyalty of entire legions was now watching his army dissolve before his eyes. His soldiers were deserting not because they didn't love him, but because they could see he was leading them toward disaster. His treasury was empty, forcing him to borrow gold from Egyptian merchants just to pay his troops. Most humiliating of all, his Roman allies were beginning to quietly switch sides, sensing that they had backed the wrong horse. Antony's personal life had become a political catastrophe. His marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia had been arranged to seal their alliance, but Romans expected him to at least maintain the appearance of respect for his wife. Instead, he had publicly divorced her to marry Cleopatra, handing Octavian the perfect weapon to destroy his reputation. Here's what made it even worse. Antony knew he was making mistakes, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. Love had clouded his judgment, and everyone could see it. His own officers whispered behind his back, wondering if their once great general had lost his mind along with his Roman identity. The irony was devastating. Antony had spent his entire career building a reputation as Rome's most reliable general, and now he was dependent on his foreign lover's wealth to keep his army from mutinying. It was humiliating, and the humiliation was eating him alive. Now let me tell you about Cleopatra, because she's probably the most misunderstood person in this entire story. Hollywood wants you to think she was just some exotic beauty who seduced powerful men for entertainment. The truth is far more impressive and far more tragic. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of a kingdom that had existed for 3,000 years before Rome was even founded. She was fluent in 9 languages, had personally negotiated trade agreements with kings from India to Spain, and was equally comfortable discussing philosophy with Greek scholars or mathematics with Egyptian priests. She had survived in the deadliest political arena in the ancient world by being smarter, more ruthless, and more determined than any of her rivals. But here's what made her desperate. She knew that if Octavian won, Egypt would cease to exist. Not just conquered, but erased from history. Rome had a habit of making examples of kingdoms that dared to challenge its authority. Carthage had been burned so completely that nothing would grow in its soil for generations. Corinth had been destroyed so thoroughly that it took a century to rebuild. Egypt, with its ancient pride and accumulated wealth, would be next on the list. Cleopatra's fleet wasn't just her contribution to the battle, it was Egypt's last hope of survival. These weren't ordinary warships. They were floating treasuries, carrying the accumulated wealth of dozens of pharaohs, the gold that decorated their prows, the silver that reinforced their rams, the precious gems that adorned their figureheads. All of it represented centuries of Egyptian prosperity. She was also fighting for her children's lives. Her son Caesarion claimed to be Julius Caesar's heir, and her twins with Antony represented the future of both Egypt and Rome. In the brutal world of Roman politics, children of defeated enemies were usually killed to prevent future rebellions. Cleopatra knew that if she lost this battle, she would be condemning her own children to death. As the summer of 31 before Christ dragged on, Octavian's strategy became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't planning to defeat Antony in some glorious battle. He was going to strangle him slowly, methodically, like a spider wrapping its prey in silk threads. Agrippa's ships formed an invisible noose around Actium's bay. Every supply ship from Egypt was intercepted. Every reinforcement from the eastern provinces was turned back. Every attempt to break out was met with superior numbers and better tactics. It was a masterclass in how to destroy an enemy without giving them the chance to die heroically. The psychological warfare was even more effective than the physical blockade. Every day that passed made Antony's situation worse. His men grew hungrier, his allies grew more nervous, and his options grew fewer. Octavian didn't need to win a dramatic victory, he just needed to wait while his enemy destroyed himself. The blockade was so effective that Antony's soldiers were reduced to eating roots and tree bark. Disease spread through the camps as sanitation collapsed. Morale shattered as men realized they might be fighting for a lost cause. Some of Antony's most trusted commanders began sending secret messages to Octavian, offering to switch sides in exchange for pardons and positions in the new order. By early September, the trap was complete. Antony faced 3 choices, and all of them led to disaster. He could try to break out by sea, risking everything on a naval battle against Agrippa's superior fleet. He could march his army north and fight on land, abandoning his ships and leaving Cleopatra defenseless. Or he could surrender, knowing that Octavian would never allow him to live. In the end, love made the choice for him. Cleopatra couldn't abandon her fleet and her kingdom's treasure. Antony couldn't abandon the woman who had become his whole world. They would sail out together, fight together, and if necessary, die together. It was romantic, it was tragic, and it was exactly what Octavian had been counting on. The patient spider had woven his web perfectly, and now his prey was finally ready to fly straight into it. September 2nd, 31 before Christ. The sun rose over the Ionian Sea like a blood-red eye, and everyone who witnessed it knew they were about to see history turn on its axis. The morning air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that comes before thunderstorms or battles that will be remembered for centuries. Picture this scene. Nearly 400 ships spread across the water like a floating city. The morning mist clung to the waves, making the vessels appear and disappear like ghosts from some ancient myth. You could hear the creak of timber, the splash of oars, and underneath it all, the sound that every sailor dreads, the low rumble of ships preparing for war. Octavian's fleet formed up first, and it was a sight to behold. Agrippa had positioned his ships in a perfect crescent, like a hunter's bow drawn and ready to loose its arrow. These weren't the massive floating fortresses that Romans usually built. They were sleek, predatory things designed for speed and killing efficiency. Each ship carried its crew of seasoned Marines, men who had been drilling for this moment for months. But here's what made Octavian's fleet truly dangerous: discipline. Every captain knew exactly where to position his ship, every Marine knew his role, every archer had his targets already picked out. This wasn't just a navy. It was a machine built for one purpose, and that purpose was about to be tested. Antony's fleet was a different story entirely. His ships were magnificent in their own way, massive galleys that towered over the water like floating castles. They were loaded with siege towers, ballistas, and enough supplies to survive a long campaign. But that was the problem. They were so heavily laden that they moved through the water like exhausted beasts struggling through deep mud. You have to understand what Antony was thinking. He wasn't just planning to fight a battle. He was planning to escape. Every one of his ships was packed with treasure, supplies, and the apparatus of government. These weren't just warships. They were arks, carrying everything needed to rebuild his empire somewhere else if the battle went badly. When the fleets finally met, the sound was like the end of the world. Bronze rams punched through wooden hulls with a noise that could be heard miles away. The sea turned white with foam, then red with blood. Arrows filled the air like deadly rain, and the screams of dying men mixed with the crash of splintering timber. At first, it looked like the battle might go either way. Antony's ships were bigger and carried more men, and size still mattered in naval warfare. His Marines were veterans who had fought in dozens of battles, and they knew how to board enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand in the cramped spaces between decks. But Agrippa's strategy was already working. His lighter ships could dance around Antony's heavy galleys, striking like wasps and then darting away before the enemy could respond. His fire arrows were turning wooden ships into floating furnaces, and his disciplined crews were executing maneuvers that Antony's overloaded vessels simply couldn't match. The battle raged for hours under the September sun. Men fought and died on decks slippery with blood, while the sea around them filled with debris and bodies. This was warfare at its most brutal and personal, where you could see the face of the man trying to kill you. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, something happened that no one expected. Cleopatra's squadron, 60 of Egypt's finest ships, suddenly broke away from the battle. Their sails caught the wind, and they began racing south toward the open sea. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because no one really knows why she did it. Was it cowardice? Was it strategy? Was it desperation? Cleopatra claimed later that she was trying to save Egypt's treasure and give them a base to fight from. Her enemies said she panicked and fled, abandoning her allies in their darkest hour. But think about it from her perspective. She could see the battle turning against them. Her ships were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and slowly being destroyed. If she stayed and fought to the death, Egypt would die with her. If she escaped with her fleet and treasure, there might be a chance to rebuild, to fight another day. Here's the moment that changed everything. Antony saw Cleopatra's ships sailing away, and he made a choice that would haunt him forever. He abandoned his flagship, abandoned his men, abandoned everything he had spent his life building, and followed her. Can you imagine what this looked like to his soldiers? Their general, the man they had followed across half the world, was sailing away while they were still fighting for their lives. The psychological impact was devastating. If Antony didn't believe they could win, why should they keep fighting? One Roman officer who survived the battle later wrote, "We watched our general flee and knew Rome would never forgive us." That single sentence captures the tragedy of it all. These men weren't just losing a battle. They were losing their honor, their identity, their future. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. Ship after ship surrendered as word spread that Antony had fled. Some tried to fight on, but without leadership, without hope. They were picked off one by Agrippa's methodical crews. The sea around Actium became a graveyard. Broken ships drifted with the tide, their decks littered with the dead and dying. The water was thick with debris, splintered masts, torn sails, bronze rams that had been knocked loose in the fighting. Survivors clung to pieces of wreckage, hoping to be rescued by their own side rather than captured by the enemy. Octavian's victory was so complete that he could afford to be merciful. He accepted the surrender of entire squadrons, pardoned officers who had fought against him, and even recruited some of Antony's best men into his own forces. It was a masterclass in how to win a civil war, destroy your enemy's ability to fight, but welcome his followers back into the fold. But let's not forget the human cost of this victory. Thousands of men died in the waters off Actium, many of them Romans fighting against other Romans. Families were destroyed, friendships shattered, and an entire generation of leaders was wiped out in a single afternoon. The survivors faced a terrible choice. They could try to follow Antony to Egypt, knowing they would be branded as traitors and hunted for the rest of their lives. Or they could surrender to Octavian and hope for mercy, knowing that mercy in Roman politics was never guaranteed. Most chose surrender. They had seen enough death for one day, and they understood that the world had fundamentally changed. The republic they had grown up in was dead, killed not by foreign enemies, but by its own ambitions and contradictions. News of the battle spread across the Mediterranean like wildfire. In Rome, Octavian's supporters celebrated in the streets, while his enemies quietly began making plans to leave the city. In Egypt, Cleopatra and Antony tried to convince themselves that they could still win, that this was just a temporary setback. But everyone else understood the truth. The Roman Republic had died in the waters off Actium. What would replace it was still unclear, but there was no going back to the old system of senatorial rule and shared power. The Battle of Actium lasted only one day, but its consequences would shape the next 5 centuries of human history. It was the moment when the ancient world's greatest republic became its greatest empire, and nothing would ever be the same. In the end, it wasn't superior numbers or better ships that won the day. It was discipline, strategy, and the ability to stay focused when everything around you was falling apart. Octavian had learned the most important lesson of warfare. Battles are won not by the bravest or the strongest, but by those who make the fewest mistakes when it matters most. Who would you have supported? Octavian's disciplined legions or Antony's fiery alliance with Egypt? Let us know below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The year after Actium was like watching a slow-motion tragedy unfold. Antony and Cleopatra had escaped the battle, but they hadn't escaped their fate. They sailed back to Egypt with what remained of their fleet, but everyone knew it was over. The question wasn't whether they would lose, but how they would choose to die. Picture Alexandria in the summer of 30 before Christ. Once the greatest city in the world, it now felt like a beautiful tomb. The palace that had hosted Julius Caesar and welcomed Roman senators was filled with the quiet desperation of people who knew the end was coming. Antony spent his days drinking and reminiscing about past victories, while Cleopatra frantically tried to find some escape route that didn't exist. They called it the Society of the Inimitable Livers, this group of doomed nobles who gathered each night to feast and drink as if tomorrow would never come. It was gallows humor at its finest, a way of laughing at death while it circled overhead like a vulture. But beneath the forced gaiety, both lovers were making their final preparations. Cleopatra tested different poisons on condemned prisoners, looking for the one that would kill her most painlessly. Antony practiced with his sword, making sure his hand was steady enough to do what needed to be done when the time came. Meanwhile, Octavian was marching toward Egypt with the methodical patience of a man who knew victory was inevitable. He had learned from his adoptive father's mistakes. Julius Caesar had been too merciful with his enemies, allowing them to regroup and strike back. But Octavian was also too smart to simply butcher everyone who had opposed him. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He offered pardons to anyone who surrendered, but made it clear that the leaders would have to die. It wasn't personal, it was political necessity. As long as Antony and Cleopatra lived, they would remain symbols of resistance, potential rallying points for future rebellions. The message was clear: submit and live, or resist and die. Most chose submission. One by one, Egypt's governors and generals opened their gates to Octavian's forces. The country that had defied Rome for 3 centuries was collapsing without a fight. When Octavian's army finally reached Alexandria, the city surrendered almost immediately. There would be no dramatic siege, no heroic last stand, just the quiet capitulation of a civilization that had run out of options. Antony made one final attempt to die like a Roman general, challenging Octavian to single combat. The response was exactly what you'd expect from a man who had spent his career avoiding unnecessary risks: silence. Octavian wasn't interested in giving his enemy a chance for a glorious death. He wanted this to end quickly and quietly. The end came in August of 30 before Christ. Antony, believing that Cleopatra was already dead, fell on his sword in the tradition of defeated Roman commanders. But his aim was poor, and he lingered in agony for hours before finally dying in his lover's arms. Cleopatra lasted a few days longer, trying one final time to negotiate with Octavian. She offered him her treasure, her kingdom, even her body, if it would save her children's lives. But Octavian had already decided her fate. She would be taken to Rome, paraded through the streets in chains, and displayed as a trophy of his victory. Rather than face that humiliation, Cleopatra chose death. The famous story about the snake hidden in a basket of figs might be legend, but the truth is simpler. She died by her own choice, on her own terms, in her own palace. It was the last act of defiance from a woman who had never learned to surrender. With his enemies dead, Octavian faced a problem that would have challenged any politician. How do you become a king without calling yourself one? How do you seize absolute power in a culture that had spent 5 centuries hating the very idea of monarchy? The answer was pure genius. Instead of declaring himself emperor or dictator, Octavian performed one of the greatest political magic tricks in history. He gave all his powers back to the Senate, then graciously accepted when they begged him to keep them. He called himself Augustus, which meant the revered one, and insisted that he was simply the first citizen among equals. It was a masterclass in how to seize power without looking like you're seizing power. Augustus created the fiction that the Republic still existed, that the Senate still mattered, that Roman traditions were still intact. But everyone understood the reality. Rome now had a king, in all but name. Here's what made Augustus so much more successful than his adoptive father. He understood that Romans would accept tyranny as long as it came wrapped in familiar traditions. Julius Caesar had been too honest about his ambitions, too willing to break with the past. The senators who killed him weren't just defending the Republic, they were defending their own relevance. Augustus learned from that mistake. He kept the Senate, but made sure they only discussed what he wanted them to discuss. He maintained the old magistrates, but ensured they were all his supporters. He preserved the forms of the Republic while gutting its substance. The contrast is striking. Caesar was stabbed to death for his ambition, dying on the floor of the Senate House beneath a statue of his old enemy Pompey. Augustus died peacefully in his bed at the age of 75, surrounded by grieving senators who begged his heir to continue the family tradition. The Roman Empire was born not with fanfare and celebration, but with a quiet transformation that most people didn't even notice happening. Augustus didn't conquer the Republic. He evolved it into something entirely different while pretending nothing had changed. This new system would last for centuries. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, brought stability to a world that had been torn apart by civil wars for generations. Trade flourished, cities grew, and Roman law spread to every corner of the known world. But the cost was enormous. The Republic had been chaotic, inefficient, and often brutal, but it had also been dynamic. It had produced great orators, brilliant generals, and fierce debates about the nature of justice and power. The empire was stable and efficient, but it was also static. Creative thinking was discouraged. Dissent was dangerous. And the energy that had built Rome's greatness slowly began to fade. Let's not forget the human cost of this transformation. Thousands of Romans died in the civil wars that brought Augustus to power. Entire families were wiped out. Ancient senatorial bloodlines were extinguished, and a generation of leaders was destroyed. The survivors faced a new world where the old rules no longer applied. Senators who had once debated the fate of nations now spent their time competing for Augustus's favor. Generals who had once conquered kingdoms now waited for permission to leave Italy. Citizens who had once voted for their leaders now watched ceremonies where their voices were purely decorative. It was a fundamental change in what it meant to be Roman. The Republic had been a partnership between citizens and their government. The empire was a relationship between subjects and their ruler. The difference was profound, and it would shape Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. In the end, Octavian's victory was so complete that it became his greatest problem. He had destroyed everyone who could challenge him, but he had also eliminated everyone who could help him govern. The Senate was full of yes-men. The army was loyal but unthinking, and the people were content but passive. Augustus spent the rest of his life trying to solve a problem of his own creation. How do you rule an empire when you've eliminated everyone capable of independent thought? How do you maintain a system based on the fiction of shared power when everyone knows only one person's opinion matters? The answer, as it turned out, was very carefully. Augustus walked a tightrope for 45 years, balancing the competing demands of stability and legitimacy, power and tradition. He succeeded brilliantly, but his success created a system that would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. The Battle of Actium had ended with ships burning on the Ionian Sea. Its aftermath ended with the birth of an empire that would dominate the world for centuries, built on the bones of a republic that had forgotten how to govern itself. It was a transformation as complete as it was irreversible, and it all began with a 32-year-old man who understood that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with swords, but with words and the careful management of appearances. Here's the thing about the Battle of Actium. It didn't just decide who would rule Rome for the next few years. It fundamentally changed what Rome was, and that change would echo through the next 2 centuries of human history. What Augustus created in the aftermath of that September day was something the world had never seen before. An empire that looked like a republic, ruled by men who called themselves servants while wielding the power of gods. Picture this. For 500 years, Rome had been a city where ambitious men could rise through talent and determination. The Forum had been alive with debate, where senators argued passionately about war and peace, taxes and treaties. It was messy, chaotic, and often violent, but it was also dynamic. New ideas could emerge from anywhere, and even a farmer's son could rise to become consul if he was clever enough and lucky enough. Augustus changed all of that, but he did it so gradually that most people didn't even notice it happening. He kept the Senate, but made sure they only discussed what he wanted them to discuss. He maintained the old elections, but ensured that only his supporters could win. He preserved the ceremonies of the Republic while quietly draining them of all meaning. It was like watching a living tree slowly turn to stone. From a distance, it still looked the same. But touch it, and you'd realize that all the life had gone out of it. The forms remained, but the substance had been transformed into something entirely different. The most chilling part of this transformation was how willingly Romans accepted it. After generations of civil war, they were exhausted. They had watched their greatest generals tear each other apart, seen their cities burned by their own armies, and buried too many sons in conflicts that seemed to have no end. So when Augustus offered them peace in exchange for their freedom, most Romans didn't hesitate. They were tired of democracy, tired of responsibility, tired of having to think about politics and governance. Let one man make all the decisions, they said. Let him bear the burden of leadership while we get on with our lives. The Senate, once the proud guardian of Roman liberty, became little more than a ceremonial body. Senators who had once debated the fate of nations now spent their time competing for Augustus's favor like courtiers in a royal palace. The passionate oratory that had once filled the Forum was replaced by careful, polite speeches that said nothing of importance. It was a profound psychological shift. Romans had once seen themselves as citizens, partners in the great enterprise of governing an empire. Now they were subjects, grateful recipients of their rulers' benevolence. The change was so complete that within a generation, most Romans couldn't imagine living any other way. What Augustus created was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and by any measure it was an extraordinary achievement. For 200 years, from Augustus's victory at Actium until the crisis of the 3rd century after Christ, the Roman world enjoyed unprecedented stability and prosperity. Trade flourished as never before. Roman merchants could travel safely from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, protected by laws that were enforced from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Cities grew and prospered. Art and literature flourished under imperial patronage. The population of the empire reached levels that wouldn't be seen again in Europe until the 18th century. But this golden age came at a price that's easy to overlook if you focus only on the statistics. The creative energy that had built Rome's greatness slowly began to fade. When power is concentrated in one man's hands, everyone else becomes a follower rather than a leader. Innovation becomes dangerous because it might challenge the established order. Think about it this way. The Roman Republic had produced Julius Caesar, Cicero, Pompey, and dozens of other larger-than-life figures. The early empire produced capable administrators and competent generals, but few genuine innovators. The system that Augustus created was designed for stability, not for creativity, and it achieved exactly what it was designed to do. Here's the most important thing to understand about Actium's legacy. Once Augustus had concentrated power in his own hands, that power was never given back. Not because he was evil, or because his successors were tyrants, but because the system he created made it impossible. Every emperor who followed Augustus faced the same basic problem. How do you maintain control over an empire that stretches from Scotland to Sudan? The answer was always the same. You need absolute authority, loyal armies, and a bureaucracy that answers only to you. Any attempt to share power or restore the old republican institutions would have led to chaos and civil war. This is the trap that all successful revolutionaries face. They seize power to solve a crisis, but the very act of seizing power creates new problems that can only be solved by keeping it. Augustus couldn't give the Senate back its authority because the Senate had proven it couldn't handle that authority. He couldn't restore the old system because the old system had already destroyed itself. The transformation that began at Actium would shape Western civilization for the next 2 millennia. The Roman Empire became the template for how large-scale political systems work. Every subsequent empire, from Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire to Napoleon's French Empire, would copy Augustus's basic formula: concentrate power in one leader, maintain the appearance of traditional institutions, and promise stability in exchange for obedience. Even today, you can see echoes of Augustus's system in modern politics. The way democratic governments expand executive power during crises, the way bureaucracies grow and become self-perpetuating, the way citizens trade freedom for security during times of uncertainty, all of these patterns were established in the decades after Actium. But let's not forget the human cost of this transformation. The generations that lived under the Pax Romana were safer and more prosperous than their ancestors, but they were also less free. They couldn't choose their leaders, couldn't criticize their government, couldn't even move freely without imperial permission. The vibrant political culture that had once made Rome the envy of the ancient world gradually withered away. Public debate became dangerous. Independent thinking was discouraged, and the energy that had once driven Roman expansion and innovation was channeled into maintaining the status quo. It's a perfect example of what political scientists call the security-freedom trade-off. Augustus offered Romans perfect security, and most of them were happy to accept it. But perfect security comes at the cost of perfect freedom, and once that trade is made, it's almost impossible to reverse. The greatest irony of Augustus's achievement is that it was too successful. The Pax Romana lasted so long that Romans forgot how to govern themselves. When the empire finally began to collapse in the 3rd century after Christ, there was no one left who remembered how the old republic had worked. The Senate still existed, but it was filled with men who had never made a real decision in their lives. The people still gathered in the forum, but they had no experience with genuine democratic participation. The institutions of the republic had been preserved like museum pieces, beautiful to look at, but completely non-functional. The Battle of Actium forces us to confront one of the most difficult questions in political philosophy. Is it better to be free and chaotic, or stable and controlled? The Roman Republic had been violent, unpredictable, and often unjust, but it had also been dynamic and creative. The Roman Empire was peaceful, efficient, and generally fair, but it was also static and stultifying. Most Romans of Augustus's time would have chosen the empire without hesitation. They had lived through the horrors of civil war and were grateful for any system that could guarantee peace. But their great-grandchildren, who had never known anything but imperial rule, might have made a different choice if they had understood what they were missing. Today, as we watch democracies around the world struggle with polarization, inefficiency, and the temptation to concentrate power in strong leaders, the lesson of Actium remains painfully relevant. The battle that ended the Roman Republic wasn't won by foreign enemies or natural disasters. It was lost by Romans who decided that freedom was too expensive and democracy too difficult. Augustus didn't destroy the Republic. He simply offered Romans an alternative that seemed more attractive. The fact that they accepted his offer so readily tells us something important about human nature and the fragility of democratic institutions. The waves that washed the shores of Actium on that September day in 31 before Christ carried away more than just the wreckage of Antony's fleet. They carried away 5 centuries of republican government, democratic tradition, and the idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves. What they left behind was an empire that would endure for centuries, built on the foundation of a choice that could never be unmade. The lesson of Actium isn't just about ancient history. It's about the eternal tension between freedom and security, between the chaos of democracy and the stability of autocracy. It's a reminder that the most important battles aren't always fought with swords and ships, but with ideas and institutions, and that the victories that seem most complete are often the ones that change us in ways we never intended. So here we are, at the end of one of history's most remarkable stories. We've followed Cyrus from his humble beginnings as a shepherd boy to his rise as the founder of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. We've watched him conquer cities, without destroying them, unite peoples without crushing their spirits, and build something that lasted long after he was gone. But what does it all mean? What can we learn from a man who lived over 2,000 years ago in a world so different from our own? The answer, I think, lies in understanding what Cyrus really accomplished. He didn't just build an empire. He redefined what power actually means. Before Cyrus, power was simple. It was the ability to make people do what you wanted through force or fear. The strongest army won, the most ruthless ruler lasted the longest, and might made right. Cyrus looked at that system and said, "What if there's a better way?" What he discovered was something that seems obvious to us now, but was revolutionary in his time: that people will work harder, fight more bravely, and remain loyal longer when they're treated with respect rather than fear. That diversity isn't a weakness to be suppressed, but a strength to be celebrated. That the best way to hold an empire together isn't through oppression, but through inclusion. These ideas didn't die with Cyrus. They spread throughout the ancient world, influencing everyone from Alexander the Great to the Roman emperors. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he was so impressed by Cyrus's methods that he adopted many of them himself. He married local nobles, respected local customs, and tried to create his own version of a multicultural empire. The Romans, too, learned from Cyrus's example. Their empire lasted for centuries, partly because they understood that conquered peoples needed to feel like they had a stake in the system. They offered citizenship to their subjects, allowed local governance, and created a sense of shared Roman identity that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. But the influence of Cyrus's ideas didn't stop with the fall of ancient empires. Jump forward to the 18th century, and you'll find the American founders grappling with the same questions Cyrus had faced. How do you unite different peoples under one government? How do you balance unity with diversity? How do you create a system that respects individual rights while maintaining collective strength? The solutions they came up with, enshrined in documents like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, echo principles that Cyrus had established over 2 millennia earlier. The idea that people have certain fundamental rights that governments must respect. The notion that diversity can be a source of strength rather than weakness. The belief that true authority comes from the consent of the governed rather than the power of the sword. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the connection becomes even more direct. When the United Nations was founded after World War II, its members were trying to create a framework for international cooperation that would prevent future conflicts. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, establishes principles that would have sounded remarkably familiar to Cyrus: that all people have the right to freedom of religion, to maintain their own cultures, and to be treated with dignity regardless of their background. In fact, the Cyrus Cylinder is sometimes called the first Charter of Human Rights, and a replica of it sits in the United Nations headquarters in New York. It's a powerful reminder that the ideas we consider most modern, most progressive, most enlightened actually have roots that stretch back to the very beginning of recorded history. But here's what I find most fascinating about Cyrus's legacy. It's not just about politics or government. It's about how we choose to treat each other as human beings. Every time someone chooses to listen to a different perspective rather than dismiss it. Every time someone shows mercy instead of seeking revenge. Every time someone builds bridges instead of walls. They're following in Cyrus's footsteps. Think about it. In our own time, we face many of the same challenges that Cyrus faced. We live in a world that's more connected than ever before, where people from different cultures, religions, and backgrounds have to find ways to live and work together. We have to figure out how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to maintain unity while respecting diversity, how to build institutions that can last beyond any single leader. The questions Cyrus grappled with are still our questions. What makes a good leader? How do you create lasting change? What's the difference between power and authority? How do you build something that will outlast your own lifetime? His answers were simple but profound. Lead by example. Treat others with the respect you want to receive. Understand that your strength comes not from what you can force people to do, but from what they choose to do willingly. Build systems that can survive without you. Remember that the greatest victories are the ones that don't require defeating anyone. These aren't just political principles, they're human principles. They apply whether you're running a country, managing a team, raising a family, or just trying to be a good neighbor. They remind us that the most powerful force in the world isn't fear or hatred or violence, but the simple recognition that we're all in this together. So when you hear about conflicts between different groups, when you see people being divided by fear and suspicion, when you wonder whether it's possible for people with different beliefs to live together peacefully, remember Cyrus. Remember that over 2,000 years ago, a shepherd boy from ancient Persia proved that it could be done. He showed us that diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be celebrated, that differences can be sources of strength rather than weakness, that the best way to conquer hearts is not through force, but through understanding. The empire that Cyrus built eventually fell, as all empires do. But the ideas he championed, the principles he established, the vision he shared, those have proven to be immortal. They've inspired countless leaders, influenced countless movements, and given hope to countless people who believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way to live together. His story reminds us that real change doesn't come from those who have the biggest armies or the loudest voices. It comes from those who have the courage to imagine a different kind of world and the wisdom to show others how to build it. It comes from those who understand that the greatest conquests are not of lands or peoples, but of fear and prejudice and the small-minded belief that we have to choose between strength and compassion. Cyrus the Great died on a battlefield in Central Asia over 2 millennia ago, but his real victory was never about any single battle. His real victory was proving that there's another way to live, another way to lead, another way to build something that lasts. And in a world that often seems to have forgotten that lesson, his story is more relevant than ever. The greatest conquerors, as it turns out, are not those who rule lands, but those who rule hearts. And the greatest empires are not those built on fear, but those built on the revolutionary idea that all people, regardless of where they come from or what they believe, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. That's the legacy of Cyrus the Great. That's the lesson that echoes across the centuries. And that's why, more than 2,000 years after his death, we're still talking about the shepherd boy who became a king and changed the world forever. If this story of ambition and betrayal moved you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world.